Imagine waking up in your $5 million condo, walking to the kitchen for coffee, only to realize the floor beneath your feet feels strangely slanted today. You place a single marble on the marble counter and watch in silent horror as it slowly begins to roll toward the window, accelerating with every passing second. This was not a scene from a disaster movie, but the terrifying daily reality for residents of the Millennium Tower, once the pride of the San Francisco skyline. For years, this was the Leaning Tower of San Francisco, a 600-foot skyscraper that was sinking 1 inch every single year into the soft, wet earth. Its massive foundation was essentially balanced on a wet sponge, a design choice that would eventually lead to one of the greatest engineering scandals in modern American history. Now that it is 2026, engineers claim to have performed a miracle by anchoring the massive building to the crust of the earth while people slept inside. They have won the prestigious Project of the Year award, and the city says the crisis is over. But the monthly monitoring reports tell a much weirder story. While the sinking has finally stopped, the building itself is still not standing straight, remaining a crooked monument to human greed and the failure of architectural oversight today. To understand how bad this situation truly got, you first have to understand how incredible and promising everything looked back in the optimistic days of 2009. San Francisco had not seen a major downtown high-rise development in nearly 20 years, making the grand opening of the Millennium Tower a massive event for the city. Standing 58 floors tall and reaching 645 feet high, the structure offered 419 luxury units for the global elite to purchase. Apartments started at around $2 million and climbed past $13 million for the penthouses, totaling $750 million in sales for the lucky developers. Considering the project cost roughly $350 million to build, it looked like a massive financial win on paper for everyone involved in the initial phase. To sell a dream of this magnitude, you need a powerful name, so they recruited Joe Montana, the 4-time Super Bowl champion, to be the face of luxury. Montana promoted the building and even signed a lease-to-buy deal, making it seem like the legendary athlete truly believed in the structural integrity of this shining glass tower. While this overwhelming success was happening above the ground, something dark and dangerous was quietly shifting in the depths of the soil, far below the tower's heavy foundation. To understand why this massive skyscraper began to lean, we must look beneath the surface at the 990 foundation piles supporting the entire building today. These were pre-stressed, pre-cast concrete columns driven deep into the earth, which sounds incredibly solid to anyone who is not a professional structural engineer or a specialized geotechnical expert. However, there was a major catch, because those piles only went 60 to 90 feet down into a layer of soil that the local geologists simply called the coland layer. The actual solid bedrock was located 200 feet down, meaning the foundation piles never actually reached the stable stone required to support such a massive and heavy vertical structure. Instead of resting on rock, the piles were just gripping sand and relying entirely on friction to hold up a structure weighing well over 200 million pounds in total. This specific design choice mostly came down to a matter of money and short-term profit margins for the developers who were managing the expensive construction project at that time. Reaching the bedrock would have added about $4 million to a $350 million project, a relatively small amount that they chose to save instead. Their original geotechnical report also predicted only 4 to 5 inches of settling over the entire lifetime of the building, making their cost-saving approach seem perfectly fine on paper. Peer review was not pushed either, even though a nearby project at 80 Natoma Street had a similar foundation design rejected by the city authorities just a few years earlier. They skipped that crucial verification step because everything still looked good on the technical reports, and the developers were eager to begin the construction process as quickly as possible. The real problem was what sat underneath that sand layer, a thick deposit of soft material known to geologists as the dreaded Old Bay clay, which is extremely compressible. When you place 200 million pounds on top of this soft clay without anchoring into solid bedrock, that clay is going to shift and compress, little by little. This slow, invisible movement did not take long to show up, and by 2010, just 1 year after residents moved in, people started noticing some very serious structural issues. Doors in the luxury units would no longer close correctly, and floors began to have a slight tilt that residents could feel in their balance before they could even see. Elevators started acting strangely due to the shifting alignment of the shafts, and some frightened residents even reported hearing loud, terrifying cracking sounds coming from the walls at night. At first, the tilting was subtle enough to be ignored by some, but by 2016, the leaning of the Millennium Tower was no longer a secret to the public. The massive building had already sunk 16 inches and was leaning 14 inches to the northwest, creating a visible tilt that shocked the entire high-end real estate market overnight. For a quick comparison, the famous Leaning Tower of Pisa took many centuries to lean that much, but this modern glass skyscraper managed to do it in just 7 years. Now you have a tower that is visibly leaning in one of the most expensive markets in the world, with 419 owners watching their investments vanish quickly. The massive lawsuits showed up almost immediately as the Homeowners Association went after the developer, the builder, the architects, and every single firm connected to the project. Then the city filed its own separate lawsuit, claiming that the developer had intentionally hidden the critical sinking data from the potential buyers during the initial sales period. Around the same time, Joe Montana filed his own lawsuit in 2017, asking for $2.7 million back because he felt his legendary reputation was being unfairly used. At that point, the Millennium Partners tried to shift the blame to the neighboring construction project, arguing that their groundwater pumping was making the local soil compress much faster. The Transit Authority responded with a key detail that essentially destroyed the developer's main defense during the intense and very public legal battle involving hundreds of millions of dollars. They proved the Millennium Tower had already sunk 10 inches before their construction project even started, proving the leaning was a pre-existing condition caused by the flawed foundation. Now, everyone was suing everyone in a massive legal web, while actual residents were just trying to survive in a building the world called the Leaning Tower of San Francisco. Property values began to drop hard and fast, leaving owners in a state of financial panic as they watched their life savings disappear into the cracked and broken sidewalk. On average, people were losing about $320,000 per unit, making the luxury investment a total financial nightmare for the wealthy owners involved. That $13 million penthouse was now valued closer to $9 million, while the lower floor units lost nearly 40 to 50% of their original market value. Some owners were so desperate that they argued in official tax appeals that their luxury units were actually worth exactly $0 on the open real estate market. For anyone trying to resell their property, that valuation was not far from the truth, because there were barely any buyers willing to touch the leaning glass structure today. People were essentially stuck paying massive mortgages on homes they could not sell, living in a building they could not escape, as the physical structure continued to slowly fail. Cracks began to form in the basement, and the massive glass windows started to bend from the uneven pressure created by the building's extreme lean toward the northwest. By the year 2018, the building was sinking at a steady rate of about 1 inch per year, with no end in sight for the frightened skyscraper residents. Engineers estimated there was a terrifying limit around 40 inches of total lean, where the basic systems like elevators and plumbing would simply stop working for everyone inside. This critical failure point would make the entire building unlivable and worthless, and by then, they were already more than halfway to that disastrous 40-inch mark today. There was still no clear fix in sight after years of legal battles involving hundreds of parties and the complete legal chaos that gripped the entire city of San Francisco. The situation had become a global embarrassment for the city, highlighting the massive risks of building luxury skyscrapers on soft soil without the proper engineering and safety oversight. Residents were left wondering if their high-end home would eventually collapse or become a permanent monument to greed that they would be forced to pay for forever. Every night, they lay in their expensive beds, listening to the groaning of the steel and wondering if the next inch of lean would be the one that broke. The financial damage was only part of the story, as the psychological toll of living in a tilting skyscraper began to weigh heavily on the remaining 400 owners. They were trapped between a massive debt and a sinking floor, waiting for a miracle from the engineering world that seemed less likely to arrive with every passing month. Finally, After nearly a decade of constant legal fighting and public humiliation, a global settlement was reached that set aside about $100 million for a repair. But even with this massive amount of money secured, the actual physical repair of a sinking 58-story building would be a task that no engineer had ever attempted. The challenge was to anchor a massive tower to the rock while hundreds of people were still living, sleeping, and eating inside their expensive units above the construction site. The engineer brought in to save the sinking tower was Ron Hamburger, who faced a situation that was extremely unusual even for the most experienced structural experts in the world. You have a 58-story skyscraper that is already occupied and slowly sinking into soft clay, and you simply cannot evacuate hundreds of residents realistically for years of repair. Taking the building apart from the top was impossible, so the only real option was to work from the outside, drilling down 250 feet from the sidewalk. The original ambitious plan called for 52 new piles, each 24 inches wide, to be installed along the busy Mission and Fremont streets and connected to the original foundation. Hydraulic jacks would then slowly shift the building's massive weight off the weak sand layer and onto solid rock, while engineers monitored every single tiny movement in real time. Construction officially started in October 2020, but by the summer of 2021, things went terribly wrong as the drilling process itself began disturbing the unstable soil. The building started sinking about an extra inch in just a few months, forcing the engineers to stop all work immediately and rethink their entire strategy to save the structure. The new plan was much more controlled, reducing the total number of piles from 52 to 18, but making each individual pile much stronger to handle 500 tons. They also changed the installation method to avoid disrupting too much soil and added safety mechanisms to protect the original foundation if anything shifted unevenly during the weight transfer. The critical load transfer happened in two stages, first in January 2023 and then again in June, moving the building's burden onto the newly installed bedrock pillars. By September 2023, the work was finally complete after spending $100 million and recording over 179,000 hours of intense and dangerous labor. 18 piles were successfully installed, and the results were immediate because the sinking finally stopped, and the visible lean even started to reverse very slowly for the first time. For the first time in over a decade, the massive Millennium Tower was actually moving in the right direction, a feat of engineering that had never really been done before. Somehow, against all the odds and legal challenges, they pulled it off, and by 2025, the project was getting recognized everywhere as a true masterpiece of structural repair. The tower picked up the prestigious Excellence Award, and then the Project of the Year, finally winning the highest national award in structural engineering at the National Summit. Ron Hamburger accepted the award and said the fix did not just repair the physical building, it restored confidence in its future and saved the city from a disaster. Around the same time, the San Francisco Department of Building Inspection officially closed the case, declaring the building safe and up to current seismic standards without any further work. On paper, that was the official end of the story, with the problem solved and the city ready to move on from the embarrassment of the leaning tower at last. But the official version is not always the full truth, and if you look at the monthly monitoring reports, you will see a much weirder and more complicated story unfolding. Early 2026 data reveals a much more complicated story, because while the sinking has officially stopped, the massive building is still not standing up perfectly straight today. Engineers originally modeled the fix to recover about 4 inches of tilt within the first 6 months, but the tower has only recovered about 2 inches of lean so far. The Millennium Tower is still leaning around 27 to 28 inches overall, making it a visible reminder of the structural failure that almost ruined the city's reputation forever. Now the building is behaving in two very different ways at once, because the northwest corner is locked into solid bedrock, while the central portion is still sitting on sand. That central section continues to settle slowly, at about 1/10 of an inch per year, which is technically safe but creates an internal stress between the two different foundation systems. This means the tower must be monitored until September 2033, 10 full years after the fix was completed, ensuring every tiny movement is recorded for the city's public safety. For potential buyers, just knowing that ongoing monthly monitoring exists is enough to make them hesitate and keep the resale values significantly lower than the rest of the San Francisco market. One-bedroom units that once sold for over $1 million in 2014 have recently closed for around $615,000, a massive loss for the owners. While the rest of the local real estate market started climbing again in early 2026, the Millennium Tower has failed to follow that positive trend due to its lingering reputation. Online videos and social media posts still claim the building is sinking, even though the northwest corner is actually stable at 0.032 inches of movement annually. From a purely engineering perspective, the story has a clear ending because the fix worked and the prestigious national awards were justified for such a difficult and unique structural repair. However, for the original people who bought their dream homes back in 2009, the reality is much more painful as they live with the result of a bad decision. Many of them are still paying high monthly fees while watching their investment struggle because of a decision to save $4 million on a $350 million project. A massive building that was not built correctly the first time can certainly be repaired with enough money, but the original damage to its reputation can never truly be forgotten. Was this billion-dollar project ultimately a massive success for modern engineering, or was it just an expensive failure that got patched well enough to prevent a total collapse today?